Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Lucas Jack with BB Barnes. Hope you're doing well today and enjoying this video we're going to produce for you. So as part of Rosefest, we wanted to do kind of a Ask Me Anything about roses, their care, and just questions that came in. And then so we're going to go through a couple of those right now, just some questions that were posed to us. But before we do that, just a little bit of background about myself. So I've been a rose enthusiast for, I guess, almost 2 decades, getting close to that now. But I also worked as a Rosarian at Biltmore Estate back before I came here. And so during that time of caring for over 2,000 rose bushes and really being around people within the industry and professional growers and hybridizers, you really get to learn a lot. So hopefully some of what I was able to learn over the years will help you. So we're going to dive into some questions right now. So we're going to start with, and this is the first one, and it may be one of my favorites on here, is what's the best way to prune English roses to encourage larger blooms? And so English roses are a little bit different of a class of a rose. There's a lot of different form and a lot of different structure with English roses. You get some that have kind of a traditional vase shape, almost like a hybrid tea, but then you have a lot of different varieties that are going to be more open shaped, more like a shrub rose. And so it's always good to remember that to maximize how your rose blooms, you need to think about actually the class that it's in. So English roses can constitute many different classes. They are a class of their own, but how they grow can be different. So for me, what I like to think about is this. English roses can take a little bit more time to establish. So I like to give a rose 2 to 3 years of full growing seasons before I start to really hard prune them in the winter. And really, good blooms don't start in the spring. Good blooms start in the wintertime. And so when we talk about hard pruning, this is the best place to start. Hard pruning in this area is always going to be sometime in the month of February. There's an old saying when the forsythias bloom that's the time that you need to start hard pruning. I really think about February 1st. So when February 1st rolls around, I start hard pruning my roses. I won't necessarily show you how to do that today. Maybe we can do that another time. But nonetheless, we want to hard prune in February. We're going to prune our plants back to 18 to 24 inches. And we want to leave any stems that are larger than, say, a pencil's diameter. That's why I say wait usually 2 or 3 years until a plant is fully established. Once we start hard pruning correctly, then we're really giving that rose bush an opportunity to put out the new growth that it needs to set the new growth that it needs to in the spring to produce a good bloom. There's another key part to that, and that's going to be consistent care for those first couple of years. And really, this is true of any roses. So kind of to segue into another question we got is, when is the right time to fertilize, and how do I fertilize, and how much do I fertilize? So we're going to talk about that right now in 2 different ways. So 2 different approaches to fertilization would be using like a slow release fertilizer, something like an Osmocote, or using a low yield nitrogen organic fertilizer, something like Rose Tone or Plant Tone. Those 2 different fertilizers will deliver their nitrogen and other nutrients at different rates in different ways. So what I like to do is, if I'm using slow release, and if you're comfortable using slow release, then that's something I'm going to apply in April. I'm going to apply it again in July. Okay, and at a rate of about a half a cup per plant, just sprinkle around the base of the plant. If we're using something like a Rose Tone, we're going to do that every other month. So it's April, June, August, and yes, even October. And October is important because you're getting ready to go into dormancy. Roses will still bloom almost in this area, even sometimes to Thanksgiving. You'll still have some blooms if it's not too cold, but it's important to still fertilize so that you're getting good established roots. So after a couple years of getting used to that type of fertilizer schedule, then what you will see is you'll see a vigorous, robust plant that is doing exactly what it was hybridized to do, and you should get large blooms. There's a few other things that we'll touch on in terms of how to get larger blooms out of English roses, but really early care is the key. The other thing that helps during the growing season while a rose is blooming is to consistently deadhead. And so that is, let's not overcomplicate it. That is simply just go in, pop off that dead head, because what happens with English roses is that they are more freely flowering. So unlike maybe some of the older hybrid teas where you go back to a 5-leaf node and you cut there, you don't have to do that with English roses. So I think that's a good opportunity then for us to move on to maybe a couple other questions here. Next question comes from Rachel, and she says, I planted 2 rose bushes 2 winters ago, and this summer they never come back. I don't understand why. And also she follows that up with another question about how to get better blooms out of her plants. She thinks it might be that aphids are sucking the life out of them. So I think that's again a good question to kind of follow up after the last question we had. So again, how we plant is as important as how we care for it. So what I'm going to try to show you here is actually on a couple of these plants. So we'll just use this hybrid tea for example. But if you kind of look down in here, you can see this is what's called a bud union. Okay, so what they've done is they've grafted stems onto a different type of rootstock. This is the rootstock here. Okay, and then there's another type of plant that's own root. So it's either all roses are either grown on a bud union or grown on their own roots. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, in areas where we can kind of have colder weather during the winter time, and I say colder weather, I mean, you know, we're getting out of the teens in the winter sometimes. If that bud union is planted too far above ground, it can absolutely freeze and kill the plant. And so it's important to make sure that how we see that in that pot right there is exactly the depth that it needs to be planted. Own roots, very much the same. Where the roots are actually coming out of that pot, that's where those need to be planted. Or sorry, where the stems are coming out of the pot, that's where those need to be planted. So we don't want to plant it too high and risk those stems freezing. The other part of that is that a lot of times if a rose dehydrates going into the wintertime, it will cause it to completely freeze through and get freeze damage. So again, that early care is really important. Also, on the aphids sucking the life out of our roses, I think the two questions we get probably the most are about insects and about fungus, especially here in the South. So I'm going to kind of put that question with another one here that comes just as generic one from the South. And how do you prevent and treat black spot? Living in the South is a lot different than Southern California. Sarah Lee writes that in for us. Yes, it's a lot different than Southern California. And I'm also going to put that together with, could you help prevent this from happening by leaves on a climbing rose? And it's leaf cutter. And then following that with one last question, which is aphids dislike plants like garlic, chives, and lavender. Is this true? Can we plant these next to roses to prevent them from being so pesky? So let's just take that as a broad scale question. Okay. So aphids aren't the only thing that are really going to damage your plants early in the spring. There's leaf cutters, and then there's this little thing called the western flower thrip. Aphids are generally speaking going to be handled by other insects in your garden. So it's important to have beneficial insects. So to have beneficial insects in the garden, you need other plants for them called banker plants, where those beneficials can be when the roses aren't blooming and there's not something for them to feed on there. So yes, planting companion plants, herbs, is really good around roses. Some people will plant marigolds, but again, if you plant those, you may actually be pushing away beneficial insects. And because just if we do plants that maybe keep aphids away, doesn't mean you're going to get them all away. So we want to make sure that we're using good like pollinator plants especially. So there's a wide selection of perennials here and at our other stores where you can go and find out what's a good pollinator plant for my area. Those are really good to plant with roses. They're going to bring in good insects that are going to help eat aphids. Western flower thrips are kind of a different deal. So western flower thrips and leaf cutters are really best handled by using insecticide. Now, I don't say that just kind of boldly. I understand everybody has different opinions on that. But these insects tend to be either on the underside of a leaf in like the leaf cutter, or with western flower thrips, they're actually embedded in the flower themselves. So if you see, especially in late May and June, you see a rosebud failing to open and it looks a little dingy on the outside, that is most of the time going to be western flower thrips. And what is happening is they are actually sucking the starches and sugars from the inside of the bloom, causing the bloom not to be able to open. If it does open, it doesn't open up big, it's small, it doesn't look very good. It can even have reduced fragrance to it. So the best way to actually treat for western flower thrips is you can use like a high yield insecticide granule, which is a systemic. We carry it here at the store. It does have an imidacloprid to it, but it's a much lower rate than what we would find in other insecticides that can cause a lot of damage to pollinators. So this is just low enough, but just high enough to treat things that are real pests for roses. Plus, if you have like a really like tight rose, let me show you this one here. If you have a really tight rose, such as this is really not a rose that pollinators are going to go for. Roses that pollinators like are very open roses, very simple roses like rugosas and like shrub roses, where they can actually get to the center of the bloom and get nectar and pollen from that. But these quite classic English roses, classic hybrid teas, they're really not a pollinator plant. So there's not really a high risk of damaging pollinator populations by using a systemic insecticide in those. That's really the best way to deal with those. If you don't want to use in a systemic insecticide, then what I would recommend is something that we kind of happened upon several years ago at Biltmore Estate, was that we actually debudded all of our roses. We took all the buds off, we refertilized, and actually a month and a half, 2 months later, we had an outstanding summer bloom. That's one way to do that. Yes, you're sacrificing kind of your late spring bloom, but overall you're going to get a better bloom come late in the summer. So another question would be about, we were going back to black spot, how to treat for black spot. And really the kind of best way to answer that is rose selection. So the rose that you select, proper for your area, is really important. Where you plant that rose, how you plant that rose, and how you maintain it are all key factors in really reducing black spot pressure, especially here in the South where you have a lot of humidity and a lot of heat. So for me, I tend more towards the English roses because they are a little bit more well adapted for our climate in the South, but there are some fantastic hybrid teas, some fantastic shrub roses that are on the market right now. So we want to look for stuff that's highly disease resistant. That's one. Number two is that we want to make sure that when we plant our roses, that we're not planting them too close to other shrubs where they're going to be in high competition. And we want to make sure they're getting plenty of morning and afternoon sun. So roses are full sun plants. Another question about losing a rose that was planted underneath a walnut, well, that's a location issue there. So one, it's probably getting too much shade. Two, walnuts drop acid off their leaves. So that's what's killing that rose for you. So again, placement of a rose is really key. They need to have good airflow. They need to have plenty of sun, and they need to be able to dry out. That's really important. So we used to say we don't want roses to go to bed wet, because if they go to bed wet, that's where you start to get increased fungal issues, especially a black spot. Pruning a rose is also a good way to help reduce black spots. So as you go through your season, you deadhead, but sometimes kind of resetting that rose and giving it a light prune, height prune can help with that. The new growth is going to be clean. You can also use a series of different types of fungicides. There are organic and there are conventional fungicides that you can use on roses. I like to spray. If I'm going to spray, I want to do it every other week. And sometimes I want to combo that with actually a foliar feed, a fertilizer. So you can check out, we have fungicides here at the store, both organic and conventional. Daconil is probably the most common conventional one that you can use here, but we also have Fertilome carries a natural bacteria fungicide that we carry here at the store as well, so you can check that out. It's good to kind of use those in rotation. The other thing is if you have a lot of leaves dropping due to black spot, go ahead and clean those leaves up underneath. That helps keep the fungal spores from populating underneath those roses. And then another question we got is actually about rodents and how do we keep rodents out. So Jackie writes, how do you protect roses from rodents during the winter? She had a beautiful David Austin Lark Ascending rose that was chewed into a pencil. She said she replaced it. She's put some chicken wire in the hole. Will that be enough protection? I actually would rather use hardware cloth, which is a lot smaller hole openings. It is like a mesh wire, even though it's called hardware cloth, but you can use that to actually put down around underneath the root ball of the plant. So it's very simple that as you are going to, say, use this David Austin rose, or we're going to plant it, you're basically going to cut your hardware cloth to go all the way around that root ball. And yes, you can set that in. It allows new roots to feed out, but it also keeps rodents from being able to come in and interact with those key roots of the plants. The other thing is that roses, I think some people don't realize, is that roses are not notoriously heavy-rooted plants. Over time, and what I've seen with roses over the years, is they almost develop a root system similar to that of like a grape, where they have a very strong like center root, but they have very few feeder roots. So protecting those roots early, if you have a lot of heavy rodent issues, is pretty key. Other thing is that things that will chew roses on the top are going to be definitely deer love them, rabbits love them, groundhogs love them. So you may want to consider the first several years having some protection around the roses, especially if you have a lot of animal pressure. Okay, so our last question is actually a really good one. It's more like centered around Mother's Day, but we just passed Mother's Day, but there's still plenty of time in the season to get roses and plant them. So this question says, what is the optimal amount of rose plants for a first time mother should be gifted on Mother's Day? Asking for a friend. Okay, so with that, I like to think about this question more broadly. What's the optimal number of roses that you need to have in your garden? That really depends on how large your garden is, but let's just start with 3. I really like to say let's have 3 roses to begin in our garden. The reason being is because I think about roses are really a flower to enjoy in the garden, but also a flower to enjoy inside the house. So let's have 3 different colors of roses that really work well for you, your style. For me, I kind of like more of the pastels. I like cream-colored roses. I like the salmon-colored roses. I don't have a whole lot of reds in my rose garden. I'll have a couple because it's kind of classic, but even at that, they're not going to be a true red. They're going to be a little bit more in that kind of wine color. But nonetheless, I like to think about 3 roses to start with, and I'd always recommend starting with shrub roses. So like over here in our David Austin section, kind of looking at great roses to start with. Boscabel is a fantastic rose to start with. It has a heavy fragrance to it. It's easy to prune. It's easy to deadhead. It's not an overly large rose, so it's not like something that's going to get out of control on you if you don't know what to do it in the future. So that's a really good rose to use. It's fairly disease resistant for our area, but also let's go to having something that's disease resistant. Litchfield Angel is a fantastic rose as well. It can be highly disease resistant. There's not much fragrance to it, but it's a very free flowering whitish bloom. And lastly, I love this new one, this Gabriel Oak here. It's kind of that deep pink, almost red tinge to it. Fantastic rose, good structure, good disease resistance. These are roses that can be easily used in a landscape. If you need something that's even going to be even less as far as maintenance is concerned, I have drift roses in my garden. I even use those knockouts that people like to knock on. To me, those are kind of staples in my garden. So they're going to be free flowering through the year. So if you feel like I don't want to get into a specialized rose, then start with something like a drift. Start with something like a knockout. Veranda roses by Cortez. Those are fantastic roses as well. They're easy to maintain. It's not something that's going to die if you go out of town for a week or 2. So start with 3. And then I think if you really like to rose garden from there, it's never going to stop at 3. It may end up being 30 over time. So thank you so much for your questions and hope this was beneficial to you.